Welcome, class, to the Theodicy question, the mystery of divine justice. So, what is this issue? Now, when we last talked, which I know was a while ago, back when we reviewed the Babylonian exile, one of the issues that quickly came up was this concern the people had with trying to understand this question of divine justice, or why does God allow bad things to happen? And this is one of the most difficult questions, and the timing of this presentation is either terrible or perfect, no matter, depending on how you look at it. I suppose maybe it's both. The Theodicy question is probably one of the most raw and real-time issues of religion that we get. It's an odd question because in one breath it is something that exists very much out there in theological technicalities, but it's also a question that seems to demand a present, immediate, real-world answer. So let's talk about it in greater detail. So pre-exilic conceptualization. So before the Babylonian exile, how did the Israelites, the ancient Jewish people, how did they first conceive of this notion of divine justice? Well, a lot of this was in terms of the covenantal codes, right? The set of laws and covenants first given to Abraham with from God, and then later on the full set of legal codes given to Moses, the Ten Commandments, the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Leviticus, these law books. And from this, we get this notion that divine justice is spelled out in the law. If you obey the law, then good things will happen to you. And if you disobey the law, then bad things are going to happen to you. And that's simply how the Israelites saw it. That remember, at this time, there's still a lot of questions about to what degree do the Israelites conceptualize different afterlives? And is there still a notion, there at this point, what we hear referenced is the notion of Sheol, or the land of the dead. And there isn't a mention of a different hell for bad people versus purgatory versus souls in heaven. All these things will enter into Jewish and Christian theology, but we're not at that point yet when we're talking about the covenantal codes around which were written down sometime between the year 1254 BCE and 1000 BCE. And because of that, we see this notion of divine punishment and reward meted out here in this lifetime. And we also have this notion of chosen people status. The Jews, the children of Abraham, saw themselves as God's unique and chosen people. Out of all the ethnicities and races of the world, they were the ones who God chose to show his law to. They were the ones who God chose to take out of slavery in Egypt. And there was this notion that they were kind of special. You know, God looked at all the nations of the world, but, Israel was his favorite. And because of that they kind of enjoyed a little bit of a special divine preference in matters of things like invasion and whatnot. There also is this notion that because God said to Abraham, your children will be as numerous as the stars in the heavens, that this guaranteed them a long and plentiful line. It wasn't that God was just going to let them be blighted out. Add to this, in Judah, the notion of the Davidic monarchy, that David was promised a perpetual monarchy, that his descendants would continue to reign over Israel generation after generation into infinity. And so, from this, we get this notion that, look, as long as you obey God's law, good things are going to happen to you. And even still, Israel is kind of the favorite. God's not really going to allow anything too tragic to happen to Israel because we're the chosen people, right? That's their idea, right? And David was promised a perpetual monarchy. So yeah, maybe if we've been bad, if we've been idolatrous, maybe God will let Israel lose a few battles, lose a little bit of territory on our borders, have to pay some tribute, but Israel's never going to get conquered. The temple's never going to get torn down. God wouldn't let that happen. And then the exile happens. And a lot of that comes true, right? Israel does get invaded. Its noble families carted off to Babylon as political prisoners. Its city walls and temple of Jerusalem torn down. And in the aftermath of this, a lot of people had questions about divine justice. And from this, the prophets begin to help Israel work out a new way of looking at the issue. The Babylonian exile is seen as a punishment for Judah's sins, right? That the kingdom of Judah had not been faithful to the divine law. It had not been faithful to worshiping God alone. It had not taken care of the social welfare of its citizens. And as a result of this, God had chosen to punish them. A temporary punishment of them losing some of their political power and status to the Babylonian Empire. But Babylon was seen as an instrument of that. And there's still a notion of sins penalized in this lifetime. Remember, the whole notion of good people, so to speak, and middle-of-the-road people and bad people going to different eternal locations, that still hasn't come about yet. So, now that's what's happening, right? It's not like God wasn't doing that necessarily before, but there is this notion, well, God isn't, well, at this point in history, heaven hasn't opened up yet. Jesus is the one who opens up heaven to all of us through his death on the cross and resurrection. But God did still make some differences between the souls of the righteous and the souls of those who had committed heinous crimes. But the notion still at this point among the religious authorities of Israel is that calamities are caused by one's sins or those of one's ancestors. If something bad is happening to you in your life, it's because either you've done something bad or maybe one of your ancestors, a father, a grandfather, a mother, a grandmother, did something bad, and this is God's punishment to you and to your family for this type of transgression. So, at this point, when we're coming out of the exile, Israel thinks they have a good handle on how this whole divine justice thing works. And then we arrive at the book of Job, which dares to ask a question that has perplexed believers and non-believers and scholars of religion for centuries, if not millennia. Why do bad things happen to good people, right? And the book of Job puts forward this scenario, whereby there's a gentleman by the name of Job. Spelt Job, but it's pronounced Job. And he's a righteous man. He's been living in accordance with God's will. And in the book of Job, God's sitting before the heavenly court. All the angels are there. And this one angel, the accuser, comes forward and says, look, Job isn't righteous because he's righteous. He's righteous because everything's working out for him. And bit by bit, God kind of gives this accuser the authority to kind of mess with Job, to really put Job to the test. Job loses his sons, he loses his house, his fortune, he's afflicted with a disease, and all of his friends are like, you must have done something wrong, just apologize, or end it all or something, but, you obviously screwed up. Why else would God be punishing you like this? And Job's like, look, I've racked my brain. I've gone over it again and again and again and again. I can't quite figure out what it is I did wrong. And then God shows up and there's this lengthy monologue about divine power and divine will, and the book never actually gives an answer. Job eventually is rewarded for being such a good sport about all this, and he regains his fortune, has even more sons and more wives, and everything is copacetic by the end. But it never actually answers the question. Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? It doesn't give a good answer. It doesn't really give any answer. And that raises another real concern. There are people where we see horrible things happen to them, and they definitely don't seem to deserve what's happening to them. They haven't committed any sins or high crimes. So why? And I wish I could say that as Jesus came and Christianity came into the picture, we got a handle on this again. Unfortunately, Christianity just actually made the situation all the more complicated. And the reason for that is because of Christ's undying love. Right? Christ, who is pure, is perfect, is innocent, has committed no sin, is the Son of God, is the second person in the blessed Trinity of God, is crucified, suffers a horrible, agonizing, painful death on a cross, an execution usually reserved for traitors and pirates and counterfeiters and rebels, and all the worst scum of Roman society usually get this punishment, and he's the one who gets it. And he dies for humanity, dies for our sins, is resurrected. So now you take this image of God, this deep sacrificial love for humanity, that in some ways only makes this divine justice question 10 times more complicated. Because now we have two different images. Now, we have this image of a just, a loving, and a merciful God who is willing to give his own life to die in agony for humanity. But then in the other breath, to suggest a deep love, a deep concern for humanity and human suffering and us as individuals. And yet, then how do we explain why that same God who's willing to endure death and suffering and all these trials and tribulations for us would also still allow horrible things to occur to innocent people? And this only gets crazier as time goes on. So in the Middle Ages, the three Abrahamic religions, the three religions descended from Abraham, the three religions that are basically divided by faith in the same God, yes, that's basically what happened, in a nutshell, right? The religious groups of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all separately come up with, their religious scholars, their theologians come up with these two new ideas about God. That God is omniscient and God is omnipotent. So omniscient means all-knowing, and omnipotent means all-powerful. So this only adds to the problem. If we have a God who knows everything, everything that has happened, everything that is happening right now, everything that is gonna happen, everything that might happen, all of it. There is no thing that exists that is outside God's knowledge. And also a God that is all-powerful, can do literally anything, right? Omni means every existent direction, right? So, literally anything that could be done, anything at all. You imagine it, you can conceive it, you probably can't conceive it, still within God's power to do. That's a pretty grandiose level of action.